The stagecoach rattled into Harlow just past 2 in the afternoon, and Evelyn Mercer pressed her palm flat against the door to keep from being thrown into the woman sitting opposite her. A heavy-set merchant's wife who had spent most of the 6-hour ride from Cheyenne explaining in exhaustive detail why the frontier was no place for a young woman without family connections. Evelyn hadn't argued. She'd learned a long time ago that people who needed to talk that much were usually managing their own fears, not yours. What she saw when the door swung open was not what she'd expected. She'd read Grant Calloway's letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Established ranch, solid cattle operation, good land with a reliable water source. She'd studied the words the way you study a map before a journey, committing them to memory, trusting them to be accurate. She told herself she was going into this with clear eyes. No illusions about romance, no fantasy about frontier life, just a practical arrangement between two practical people, and the chance to build something real. The main street of Harlow was a quarter-mile of packed dirt, bracketed by 2-story false fronts. A general store, a saloon with a busted shutter hanging at an angle, a feed merchant, a post office not much larger than a closet. People moved along the boardwalk at the unhurried pace of people who had stopped expecting anything new to happen. Several of them stopped to look at her, not with warmth, with the particular flat assessment of a community that had already decided what kind of story she was part of. A man came forward from the shadow of the post office awning. He was taller than she'd imagined from the letters, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and eyes the color of weathered slate. He moved like someone who'd been tired for a long time and had stopped trying to hide it. "Miss Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Calloway." She extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm, and his hand was calloused down to the palm, and he let go quickly, like he wasn't sure what was supposed to happen next. "I've got the wagon," he said. "Ranch is about 9 miles out." "All right." He picked up her trunk without being asked. She followed him around the side of the post office to where a weathered buckboard waited with a single bay horse in harness, an animal that looked like it had been eating less than it should. She climbed up without help and settled herself while he loaded the trunk into the bed. They were out of town before either of them said another word. The land opened up wide and spare on both sides of the road, sage and dry grass running flat to the foot of distant hills. The sky was enormous and completely cloudless, and the light had that particular late October sharpness that made everything look clean and severe at the same time. "The letters," Evelyn said finally. Grant kept his eyes on the road. "What about them?" "You described the ranch as established, solid cattle operation." A beat of silence. "It was. 3 years ago." She let that sit. "And now?" He worked his jaw. "Things have been difficult." She looked at the side of his face. He wasn't lying exactly. He was doing that thing men did when they'd said something true but strategically incomplete, and he was waiting to see if she was going to press it or leave it. "How difficult?" she said. He didn't answer right away. They went another quarter-mile before he said, "I owe the bank $412 on the land note. I haven't been able to make full payroll in 6 weeks. I've got 19 head of cattle that should be 40. And the bunkhouse roof needs to be replaced before the snow comes, or I'll lose 2 of my best hands to the cold." Evelyn sat with that. $412 was more money than she had ever seen in one place. $43 was what she was carrying. She'd spent everything she had getting here, not out of desperation, she told herself, but out of conviction, which she understood was not always a comfortable distinction. "Why didn't you say this in the letters?" she said. He turned and looked at her for the first time since they'd left town. His expression wasn't apologetic exactly. It was the expression of a man who'd done something he knew was wrong and had arrived at a complicated peace with it. "Because then you wouldn't have come." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the road. "That," she said, "is honest, at least." The Calloway Ranch came into view as the sun dropped toward the western ridgeline, and even in the flattening golden light, it was clear that the place was in trouble. The main house was a 2-story frame structure that might once have been well kept. You could see the ghost of that in the solid construction, the width of the porch, the river stone foundation. But the paint had been gone for a couple of years and the porch railing sagged on one end, and several of the outbuildings had an exhausted lean to them that spoke of deferred repair. 3 men were in the yard as the wagon pulled in. They watched her with the same flat assessment she'd gotten in town. "The boys," Grant said. "Tom Briggs, he's my foreman. Hector Vela, and Pete Dunmore." The one called Briggs was 50-something with a gray mustache and the expression of a man who had formed an opinion and wasn't interested in revising it. Hector Vela was lean and dark-eyed and younger than she'd expected. Pete Dunmore was barely 20, with reddish hair and ears that stuck out and a sunburn across his nose that made him look perpetually surprised. "Ma'am," Briggs said, flat as a plank. "Mr. Briggs." She stepped down from the wagon and turned to take in the full yard. Up close, the details were worse than the overview. The water trough had a crack along one side that had been plugged with rags. The hay in the near paddock was sparse. The single horse she could see in the far enclosure was hip-shot and dull-eyed. She turned back to the house. The kitchen was the first place she went, not because she'd been told to, but because she needed to understand what she was dealing with. And the kitchen was where you learned the truth of a household fastest. It was a narrow room off the back of the house with a wood range, a battered work table, and shelves that held 3 pounds of cornmeal, half a sack of dried beans, a tin of salt, and a near-empty jar of lard. That was it. She stood in that kitchen for a full 2 minutes. Then she went back to the main room where Grant was standing by the fireplace doing nothing in particular. "When did you last have a real meal here?" she said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The boys have been making do." "Making do with what? There's nothing in there." "There's cornmeal." "There's cornmeal," she repeated. She pressed her fingers against the work table and thought. "Where's your nearest town with a proper market?" "Harlow's got a general store. Dearborn's bigger. That's 14 miles north." "I'll need a list of your full debts, not an approximation. Every creditor, every amount." Grant's jaw tightened slightly. "Mrs. Calloway?" "Evelyn." "Evelyn." He said it like he was testing it. "I'm not sure what you think you're going to—" "I'm going to understand what I've walked into," she said, "so I can figure out how to walk out of it differently. That's what I think I'm going to do." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect. Not yet. More like recalibration, like he was quietly revising his expectations. "I'll get you the papers," he said. She cooked that first night with what she had. Cornmeal mush with salt, stretched thin enough for 5 servings. Beans that she'd put to soak as soon as she'd found the pot, knowing they wouldn't be ready tonight but would be there tomorrow. She found a jar of dried herbs on the very back of a high shelf, someone's remnant of a more careful kitchen, and added them to the mush on the off chance that something with flavor might lift a man's spirits, even a little. The hands ate at a table in the bunkhouse. Grant ate in the main house kitchen, and she sat across from him with the papers he'd produced from a cigar box in the back of a cabinet drawer. Handwritten notes, bank letters, invoices going back 2 years. She read while she ate. It was worse than he'd said, which she'd expected. Banks never appeared in a person's story at exactly the moment they should. The main land note was $412, but there was also a smaller debt to the feed merchant in Harlow, $107, and an outstanding balance with the blacksmith who'd shod 8 horses that were no longer in the paddock. "Where did the horses go?" she said. "Sold them, when I couldn't make payroll 2 months back." "And the other cattle?" "You had 40 head. Sold 21. He set down his fork. "I know how it looks." "It looks like a man trying to bail out a boat with a coffee cup," she said. She said it without heat. "Selling assets to cover operating expenses is how you run out of everything at once." He said nothing. The muscle in his jaw was working. "I'm not criticizing," she said. I'm describing. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She looked back at the papers. "The banknote is due in 4 months. The feed merchant wants his money before the new year, which is 6 weeks. The blacksmith is owed $40 that he's apparently been patient about. Earl's a decent man, who still needs to be paid." She set the papers down. "All right, I need to know something." Grant looked at her. "Do you want to save this ranch? Not, do you think it can be saved? Do you want to?" He was quiet for a long moment. In the silence, she could hear the wind finding the gaps in the window frame and the pop and settle of the range cooling. "My father built it," he said finally. He broke the ground himself. I watched him do it. He paused. My wife, my first wife, she helped build the kitchen. She planted the garden out back, the garden that I let go to hell. It was the most he'd said at once. She let it land before she responded. Then we're going to need to be honest with each other, she said, every day, about what we have, what we owe, what's possible and what isn't. That's a reasonable condition. It's not a condition. It's just how things are going to have to work. He picked up his fork again. You're different than I expected, he said. She looked at him steadily. You're almost exactly what I expected, she said. That's not an insult. Something moved across his face that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. He went back to his cornmeal mush. She went back to the papers. The next 3 weeks established the pattern that would define the first season. Evelyn woke before the hands. She had the range lit and water heating before the first boot hit the bunkhouse floor. She cooked what she had, which was never enough and never what she wished it was, and she made it go further than seemed reasonable by the simple application of knowledge that her mother had passed down through years of genuine necessity. Bone broth from whatever scrap she could find, stretched into something that resembled a proper base. Dried beans cooked low and long until they had an almost meaty weight to them. Cornbread that she learned to make thinner and more flavorful than the thick blocks the hands had apparently been enduring. She bartered 2 jars of that cornbread for a sack of dried apples from a neighbor's wife 3 miles east, and the night she made those apples into a simple dessert for the bunkhouse table, Pete Dunmore looked at her like she had performed an act of wizardry. I haven't had something sweet since July, he said. Don't tell me that, she said. It makes the deprivation sound too dramatic. He grinned. He was not so hard to reach, Pete. He was 20 years old and desperately homesick and had attached himself to her competence the way young people sometimes did when they found an adult who seemed to know what they were doing. Tom Briggs was a different matter. The foreman maintained a precise and consistent distance. He was not rude. He did his work. He answered questions directly when she asked them. But he watched her with the flat-eyed wariness of a man who had been disappointed before and had organized his life around the possibility of being disappointed again. She understood it. She didn't take it personally. She just kept cooking. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week, she was in the kitchen rolling out the dough for a batch of hand pies. She'd traded a half-day's worth of mending for enough flour and lard to manage it. When she heard Briggs talking to Hector in the yard, she wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The window was open to let the heat out. She's working hard enough, Hector was saying. Hard's not the problem, Briggs said. Hard don't pay the bank. She seems to know what she's doing. In the kitchen, maybe. But knowing how to make cornbread don't keep the lights on. Grant needs money, not a decent supper. A pause. You think she'll stay? Hector asked. Another pause. Longer. Women like her don't usually. Once the picture gets clear enough, they find a way back to wherever they came from. Can't blame them for it. Evelyn pressed the heel of her hand into the dough and turned it over. She thought about calling out through the window. She decided against it. She kept working. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a stub of pencil and wrote down everything she knew. Assets, the land, the 19 cattle, the 2 remaining horses, the kitchen equipment. Skills, cooking, calculation, organization. Debts. She wrote those out again precisely. Needs, flour, lard, beans, cornmeal, salt pork if she could get it, sugar if she could afford it. She wrote the word opportunity at the bottom of the page and put a question mark after it. Then she thought about the conversation she'd had 2 days earlier with Pete, who'd ridden into Harlow for supplies and come back talking about something he'd seen from the North Road. Big crew, he'd said, helping her carry in the parcels. Railroad men. They're pushing the line through that valley north of the Gideon property. Hundreds of them looked like. Maybe more. How far north, she said. 4 miles? 5? They've got a camp set up out there. Somebody said they've been at it for 2 months, and they've got another 2 to go at least. She'd nodded and filed it away. Now she looked at the word opportunity and tapped the pencil against her palm. Hundreds of men. Working hard in cold weather. 4 miles up the road. She thought about the feed merchant in Harlow who'd refused to extend her credit that morning. She thought about the bank letter with its firm deadline. She thought about Tom Briggs saying hard don't pay the bank. She circled the word opportunity. The following Saturday, she rode into Harlow alone on the older of the two horses, a brown gelding named Orrin, who had opinions about his pace and expressed them constantly. She went to the general store first. The owner, a man named Caldwell, was pleasant enough in the way of men who are deciding whether to be helpful based on the quality of your clothes, and her clothes were not particularly reassuring. She bought what she could afford, which was not much, and she asked him a question. The railroad crew north of town, where do they get their meals? Caldwell shrugged. The company sends a supply wagon twice a week, last I heard, but those boys are eating rough. Hardtack and salt pork mostly. The company's not in the business of making them comfortable. Who runs the supply operation? Company man by the name of Fletcher. He comes through town sometimes. Loud man. Wears his watch chain too long. He paused. Why? I'm just curious, she said. She went next to the land office, not because she had any specific purpose there, but because the land office was where information collected. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous disposition, turned out to be the kind of person who found talking to a woman considerably easier than talking to men. And within 10 minutes she knew that the railroad project was a major line extension, that the crew numbered somewhere between 300 and 400 men, and that the project was funded by a company out of Chicago with very deep pockets and a strict timeline. She thanked him and rode back toward the ranch. 4 miles from town, on the rise that overlooked the northern valley, she stopped Orrin and looked down. The camp was larger than she'd imagined from Pete's description. Rows of canvas tents, a rail of equipment yards, cook fires. She could see men moving in the gray afternoon light, small figures at this distance, but the sheer number of them made her breath go short for a moment. She sat on the horse in the cold air and did the arithmetic. Even at 5 cents a meal, rock bottom, cheaper than a saloon could manage, 300 men for 2 months was nearly $900. At 10 cents, it was $1,800. At 15, it was nearly $3,000, the entire bank debt. The feed merchant, the blacksmith, the bunkhouse roof, payroll, all of it and more. Her hands tightened on the reins. She rode back to the ranch thinking the whole way. That evening, she put the idea to Grant. He was in the barn working on a harness that needed resoling, and he listened to her without interrupting, which she was coming to recognize as one of his better qualities. She laid it out clearly, the crew size, the rough supply situation, the possible margin, the risk. The risk being that to execute this, she would need money she didn't have to buy food in volume, which meant spending against the last of their remaining operational funds, which meant if it failed, they had nothing. When she finished, he set down the harness. He looked at the barn floor for a moment. You want to take the last $40 in the operating account, he said. Yes. And use it to buy food. Yes. To sell to the railroad crew. Yes. He was quiet. Grant, I heard you. He picked up the harness again and turned it over. How would you even get the food out there? The wagon, and I'll need Pete to drive because Orrin isn't reliable in harness with another horse. And you'd cook where? I'd prep here and finish over the campfires. I've already worked out the menu. Nothing complicated. Beef and potato hash, corn cakes, coffee, things that travel and can be finished quickly. With whose beef? She paused. I was thinking we could afford to slaughter one of the older animals. Grant's jaw tightened. She watched him. She understood actually what she was asking. Those 19 cattle weren't just assets. They were the visible remainder of what had once been a real herd. Slaughtering one felt like an admission. It's a working animal or it's capital, she said quietly. Right now it's not functioning as either. He set down the harness. He looked at the barn wall. He looked back at her. If this fails, he said. If this fails, we're out $40 in one head of cattle, and we're exactly where we'd have been in 3 weeks anyway. She held his gaze. But I don't think it fails. How do you know? I don't, she said. But I know men who do hard physical work in the cold will pay for a hot meal they didn't have to make themselves. That's not a theory. That's a fact of human nature. He stood up slowly. He was a big man, and the barn was not so tall, and he seemed to fill more than his share of the space. All right, he said. She blinked. All right? You heard me? I need it in writing, she said. The authorization to use the account. He looked at her. You don't trust me. I trust you fine, she said. I just need it in writing so we both know what was agreed to. He held her gaze for a beat. Then he nodded. Fair enough, he said. She spent 2 days preparing. She made lists, then revised them. She calculated portions, then recalculated. She had Hector help her clean out the wagon bed and rig a way to transport the cast-iron Dutch oven without cracking it. She bought supplies from both Caldwell's store in Harlow and a farm woman named Ida, who sold produce out of her root cellar to anyone willing to pay fairly, which Evelyn did. The night before the first run, she barely slept. She lay in the upstairs room of the main house. They had been scrupulously formal with each other about sleeping arrangements, separate rooms, no discussion required. And she stared at the plank ceiling and ran the numbers for the 100th time. What she did not let herself think about was failure. Not because she was certain of success, but because the math on failure was already well understood and there was nothing useful left to extract from it. She thought instead about the camp, about the men who would be there in the morning, about what it felt like to be very cold and very tired and to smell food. She got up at 4. Pete was already in the kitchen when she came down, sitting at the table with his hat in his hands, looking both nervous and determined. He was 20 years old and he wanted badly to help, and she found, unexpectedly, that his presence made the darkness of the early morning less heavy. "You know you don't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She put coffee on. By 5:30 the wagon was loaded and they were moving through the cold dark toward the northern road, and Evelyn Mercer was 2 weeks into a marriage that wasn't what she'd been told, on a ranch that was 6 weeks from ruin, with $40 worth of food in the wagon bed and no particular guarantee that any of this would work. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the road unroll in the gray pre-dawn light. She had done harder things than this. Or if she hadn't, she was going to have to act like she had, which amounted to the same thing. The wagon rolled north, the cold settled in around her shoulders, and the horse's breath made clouds in the dark air, and somewhere ahead, 4 miles up this road, several hundred men were about to wake up to another morning of hardtack and salt pork. Not today, she thought. Not today, they're not. The first morning at the railroad camp did not go the way Evelyn had planned. She'd expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was outright contempt. The camp foreman was a barrel-chested man named Odell, who met the wagon at the edge of the worksite with his arms crossed and his expression suggesting he'd already decided this was a waste of his time. He was maybe 45, with a red face and the particular kind of authority that came not from intelligence, but from sheer physical confidence. The kind of man who had never once in his life been told no by someone smaller than him. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. "Hot breakfast," Evelyn said from the wagon bench. "Beef hash, corn cakes, coffee, 5 cents a plate." Odell looked at Pete, then back at Evelyn, then at the wagon. "We've got a company supply arrangement," he said. "I know. Hardtack and salt pork twice a week." She held his gaze. "Your men have been on that for 2 months. They're railroad workers, not hotel guests. They're men doing hard work in cold weather. They'd eat better if you let them." He didn't move. Around him, work had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed, as men within earshot began paying attention to the wagon in the way that hungry people pay attention to anything that smells like food, which hers did, because she'd kept the Dutch oven covered and sealed, and the beef hash had been building its smell for 4 miles of road. "I didn't authorize any outside vendors," Odell said. "I didn't ask for authorization," Evelyn said. "I came to sell breakfast. Your men can buy it or not. That's their choice and yours." A long pause. Odell's jaw worked. Then a voice from behind him, a younger man, lean and dark-haired with a Georgia accent, said, "Bah, Lord, that smells like actual food." Several men laughed. Odell turned halfway. The moment his authority cracked even a fraction, it was over, and he knew it. She could see the calculation move across his face. Make an issue of this, or let it go. Starting a confrontation over breakfast with 300 hungry men watching was not a fight he could win cleanly. He turned back to Evelyn. "One time," he said. "Of course," she said, and began uncovering the Dutch oven. It took 11 minutes to sell out completely. She hadn't brought enough, which was a failure of estimation she noted with considerable irritation at herself. She'd prepared for 150 men, and there were closer to 250 in the immediate camp, and once the smell hit open air, the line formed faster than she'd anticipated. She ran out of hash with 40 men still waiting, And those 40 men's faces were the things she carried with her the whole 9 miles back to the ranch. Pete was practically vibrating on the bench beside her. "We made $7.40, he said for the third time. "I know." "In less than 15 minutes. Pete." "Sorry." He paused. "That's still remarkable." "We ran out of food," she said. "We ran out because we sold everything. We ran out because I underestimated. 40 men got nothing. That means 40 men tomorrow are going to remember that we ran out, not that we showed up." She turned it over in her mind. "I need to triple the volume, which means I need to talk to Grant tonight." Pete went quiet. Then, "You think he'll go for it?" She thought about the barn, the way Grant had stood there with the harness in his hands and looked at the wall before saying, "All right. I think he'll listen," she said. Grant did listen. He sat at the kitchen table while she laid out the numbers, what they'd made, what she'd spent, what the margin looked like if she could scale the volume, and he listened the way she was coming to understand. He listened to everything, completely still, not giving anything away, working it through privately. $7.40, he said, on a $40 spend for food. Minus the cost of the slaughtered animal, which I'm counting separately, the net return on today's supplies alone was roughly $4 profit. In one morning. In 11 minutes. She spread her paper on the table. "If I can get the volume right and maintain this 5 days a week, the crew works Saturdays. We're looking at $30 to $35 a week, possibly more as word gets through the camp." Grant looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. "The banknote is $400, he said. 12 weeks at $30 a week is $360. Add the feed merchant debt, and we're looking at 15 weeks. She paused. "The project runs 2 more months. That's 8 more weeks. It's tight." "It's real tight." "I know." She sat down across from him. "But it's the first number that's actually moved in the right direction since I got here." He rubbed his face with both hands. He hadn't shaved in several days, and the stubble was past the point of looking casual and into the territory of looking like a man who had stopped tracking things. She noticed, but said nothing about it. "I need to slaughter 2 more head," she said. "And I need more flour and lard from Dearborn, not Harlow. Caldwell's prices are too high for the volume I need. And I need another Dutch oven if I can find one secondhand, because one isn't going to be enough. That's more money up front." "Yes." "How much?" She slid the paper toward him. He looked at the figure, $60. And something moved across his face, but he didn't say anything alarming. "All right," he said again. It was becoming, she thought, something of a pattern with him. The long silence, the working through. And then the 2 words that were, she was realizing, as close as Grant Calloway got to genuine confidence in another person. "I'll go to Dearborn tomorrow," she said. "I'll come with you." She looked up. "You don't have to." $60 is a lot of money to send out the door without me seeing where it goes, he said. There was no accusation in it, just fact. "Fair enough," she said, and almost smiled. Nick. The next 4 days reshaped something in the ranch. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single morning where everything changed. It was more like water finding a new level, gradual, quiet, and then suddenly undeniable. Evelyn got her volume right by the 3rd run. 220 plates on a Tuesday, and not a man turned away. She'd brought Hector into the operation by then because Pete alone couldn't manage the serving and the cash simultaneously while she worked the fire. Hector turned out to be surprisingly good at both, methodical with the money, quick with the ladle, and possessed of a natural ease with strangers that came from years of navigating spaces where he'd been the outsider. "You've done this before," she said to him one morning while they were loading the wagon in the dark. "My family had a small food stand in Santa Fe," he said. "When I was a kid, my mother ran it." "What happened to it?" He picked up the Dutch oven without looking at her. "She got sick. Then my father lost the building." A pause. "Then I came north and found ranch work because it was what there was." She nodded. She didn't push. He loaded the second Dutch oven. She'd found it at a hardware auction in Dearborn for $3, dinged and scorched but functional. And then he said, without turning around, "She was a good cook, better than most people knew." "What was her best thing?" Evelyn asked. He thought about it. "Tamales, Christmas ones. She'd be at it for 2 days." "Tell me how she made them." He glanced back at her, surprised. "I'm serious," she said. "Tell me while we drive." He told her. She listened all the way to the camp, and she filed it carefully in the part of her mind where useful things lived, because she was already thinking about how to vary the menu. Same volume, different offerings, to keep the line moving and the men interested. The camp itself was changing too. Odell had stopped pretending to disapprove. He still didn't speak to her with anything warmer than tolerance, but he no longer positioned himself between her and the workers, and she'd noticed on the third day that he was in line himself, third from the front, with a tin cup and a look of determined neutrality that she chose to interpret as respect. The men had begun to know her by name. Not all of them. 300 people was 300 people, but a core of regulars had emerged, the kind who came first every morning and sometimes lingered a moment longer than necessary, asking questions or making observations that were really just the opening moves of conversation. She engaged with all of them briefly and warmly and kept moving, because she'd learned fast that sentiment was fine, but efficiency paid the banknote. It was on the 6th day that she first heard the name Hargrove. One of the regular men, a big Swede named Olofsson, who always asked for extra corn cake and always paid without being reminded, mentioned it while she was refilling his coffee. "The company man's coming through," he said. "Which company man?" she said. "Hargrove, regional director, something like that, out of the Chicago office." Olofsson wrapped both hands around the tin cup. "He comes through every couple months, checks the numbers, shouts at Odell, leaves." "When's he coming?" "End of the week, maybe." "That's what I heard." She filed that away, too. She's up. Tom Briggs came to find her in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening. She was cleaning up after the day's prep. She did the morning's advance cooking in the evening now, starting the broth in the base for the hash so it could build overnight. And she heard his boots on the back step, and then he appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, which was not his usual posture. "Mrs. Calloway." "Evelyn," she said without turning from the range. A pause. "Evelyn?" He said it like it cost him something. "Can I have a word?" "You're already having one." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with an expression that she recognized, having seen it on several people in her life. The expression of someone who had decided to say something difficult and was committed but not happy about it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "I didn't think this was going to work," he said. "What you're doing out at the camp, I thought—" He stopped. Restarted. "I thought you'd be gone inside a month. I said as much to Hector." "I know," she said. "The window was open." His neck went red. "Hell." "It's all right. You weren't wrong to think it. You were working with the available evidence." Evidence changed, he said. He was still awkward, still uncomfortable, but she could see that he'd decided to get through this, and he was going to get through it. "Grant's sleeping better. Hector's got something to get up for in the morning. Even Pete." He stopped. "Pete's different. Kid's growing up." She looked at him. "And you," she said. "I want to help," he said. It came out abrupt, like he'd been holding it and had to release it quickly before he changed his mind. "Whatever you need on the ranch side, I know cattle, I know land, I know what needs to be done to get those fields back in shape. He turned his hat in his hands. "I need to know it's worth doing." She understood what he was really asking. He needed to know she was staying. She understood that too. He'd watched Grant's first wife die. He'd watched the ranch fall apart, and the grief that followed. He'd stayed through it because he was the kind of man who stayed, but staying had cost him something, and he wasn't willing to invest more of himself without some assurance. She couldn't give him certainty. Nobody could. "I don't know what this looks like in a year," she said honestly, "but I'm not leaving. This is my home now, whether I want it to be or not, and I've decided I want it to be." She paused. "That's the best I can give you." He nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. "That's enough," he said, and went back out the way he'd come. She turned back to the range. The broth was simmering exactly the way it was supposed to. She adjusted the heat anyway, because that was what you did. You kept adjusting, kept watching, kept making the small corrections that prevented the larger failures. Ite. Hargrove arrived on a Friday. She knew the moment she saw him that Odell's description of a man who came through and shouted at people had been accurate but incomplete. Hargrove was not just a man who shouted. He was a man who had learned that money created an atmosphere of permission, and he moved through the world inside that atmosphere the way fish move through water, naturally, without thinking about it, certain that the medium would accommodate him. He was 50, maybe 52, with a city overcoat that was too good for a work camp and a manner that suggested he found it slightly amusing to be standing on Wyoming dirt. He had his secretary with him, a pinched young man with a leather case. And he was talking when he got out of the buggy and still talking when he reached the serving line, which he joined without breaking stride, apparently comfortable with the assumption that being in a line did not mean waiting. He reached the front and looked at the Dutch oven and then at Evelyn. "You're the woman who's been feeding my workers," he said. "I'm the woman who's been selling your workers breakfast," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her the way men like him sometimes looked at women who said sharp things, with a flicker of recalibration quickly replaced by amusement. "Sharp," he said. "All right, I'll take a plate." She served him. He ate standing up, which she suspected was his way of demonstrating that he was never entirely at rest, never fully in any one place, always partially somewhere else. He ate efficiently, without comment, and then he handed the tin plate back and looked at her with an expression that had shifted into something more deliberate. "How many men are you moving through here a day?" he said. "Between 200 and 250. At 5 cents. 5 cents for breakfast. I've started doing midday on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's 8 cents. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his secretary, who was writing something down. Then he looked back. "What's your arrangement with the camp?" he said. "With Odell." "There is no arrangement. I came, I sold food, nobody stopped me." "No formal agreement?" "No." He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. "I'd like to talk to you," he said. "This afternoon. My man can find you a proper seat." He said proper seat the way people said it when they wanted you to understand that the offer was a courtesy and could be withdrawn. "I can be available at 3, she said. He almost looked surprised that she'd put a time on it. He recovered smoothly. 3, he said, and walked away toward Odell's tent. She watched him go. She felt something shift in her chest, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific alertness that came from recognizing that a situation was about to get significantly more complicated. She turned back to the line. There were still 30 men waiting. She kept serving. At 3 o'clock, she sat across from Warren Hargrove in a folding chair inside the largest tent in camp, which served as Odell's office and smelled of pipe tobacco and unwashed wool. The secretary was in the corner with his leather case. Odell himself had apparently been dismissed. Hargrove had a contract on the table. She looked at it and did not reach for it. "I want to formalize your operation," he said. "Give it a proper foundation. You'd be operating as an authorized vendor for the Continental Rail Construction Company. Exclusive access to this camp and 2 others within 40 miles. Volume guarantees, supply priority, the whole arrangement." "May I read it?" she said. He gestured at the document. "Of course." She picked it up. She read it carefully. Not quickly. Not the way you read something when you're trying to look like you're reading it. Actually carefully, line by line. The way her father had taught her when she was 12 years old. And he'd said, always read the paper before you sign it, Evie. Because the paper is what they intend to hold you to, not what they said out loud. It was 3 pages. She read all 3. The first page was mostly standard. Dates, parties, the scope of the arrangement. The second page was where the pricing structure lived, and she read that twice. The third page was where the real architecture of the thing became clear. The exclusivity clause ran both ways. She couldn't sell to any other operation within a 40-mile radius. That was the trap. It was buried in paragraph 7, phrased as a benefit, described as territory protection. But what it actually meant was that if the railroad pulled out early, or if a better opportunity presented itself elsewhere, she was contractually prevented from pursuing it. There was also a clause on page 3, paragraph 11, that gave the Continental Rail Construction Company the right to renegotiate pricing at 60 days' notice, which meant they could cut her margin whenever the mood struck them, as long as they gave her 2 months' warning. She set the contract down. "There are some issues," she said. Hargrove looked at her with the particular patience of a man who expected negotiation, but considered it a formality. Such as, paragraph 7, "The exclusivity clause is asymmetrical. You're asking me to limit my operations to your camps while retaining the right to terminate this agreement with 30 days' notice on page 2. If you terminate and I've honored the exclusivity, I've surrendered other markets for a contract that no longer exists. The secretary stopped writing. Hargrove looked at her without expression. The exclusivity is standard. For vendors who have no other options, maybe. I have other options. She paused. Paragraph 11 also needs to come out. The pricing renegotiation clause. Yes. That's not removable. Then the contract isn't signable. She said it without heat. She was watching his face, and she saw what she expected. Not anger, but a reassessment. He was looking at her differently than he had been 60 seconds ago, and she felt the shift and leaned into it. Mr. Hargrove, I understand what you're trying to accomplish. You want consistent food service for your crews without having to manage it internally. That's reasonable. I want a sustainable operation. That's also reasonable. The contract as written protects only your position, which means it's not actually an agreement. It's a set of conditions. A silence. The tent canvas shifted in the afternoon wind. What would you propose instead? Hargrove said. His voice had changed slightly, still controlled, but with less of the ambient amusement he'd walked in with. She thought for a moment. She had actually been thinking about this for 2 days, ever since Olafson had mentioned Hargrove's name, and she had spent those 2 days turning the possible angles over in her mind, but she kept her face from showing that. Remove the exclusivity entirely, or make it mutual. If I can't sell elsewhere, you can't bring in another vendor for the duration of the contract. Remove paragraph 11 and replace it with fixed pricing for the full contract term with a renegotiation option only at renewal. And extend the termination notice to 60 days, which gives me the same runway you've given yourself. The secretary was writing again. Hargrove sat back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was hard to read, something between irritation and genuine interest. You've done this before, he said. Read contracts? Yes. Negotiated them. I'm doing it now, she said. Another pause. He picked up the contract and looked at the third page. He set it back down. He looked at the secretary. Some wordless communication passed between them. I'll need to have the language reviewed, he said. Of course, she said. My man will be in touch within the week. She nodded and stood and extended her hand. He shook it, firmly, and with slightly more attention than he'd given the handshake that morning. She walked out of the tent and into the cold air and kept her face neutral until she was around the corner of the tent and out of sight line. Then she exhaled. Her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against her coat and breathed until they were. She'd done it. She hadn't agreed to anything ruinous. She'd read the trap and said so out loud, which was the hardest part, because saying so out loud meant being wrong in front of a man like Hargrove if she'd misread anything, and she hadn't misread anything, but you didn't know that until after. She walked back toward the wagon. Hector was loading the clean Dutch ovens into the bed. He looked up at her face and seemed to read something there. Good or bad, he said. Neither yet, she said. Possibly good. We'll know by the end of the week. He nodded and went back to loading. She climbed onto the bench and gathered the reins. The sun was dropping and the temperature had fallen several degrees while she'd been in the tent, and the road back to the ranch was going to be cold. She started Orrin moving. $7.40 on the first day. 250 plates by the 6th. A contract negotiation with a Chicago company man on the 14th. She thought about Harlow's main street and the way people had looked at her stepping off the stage. The flat assessment, the already decided story. She thought about what Tom Briggs had said through the open window. Women like her don't usually last. She clicked the horse forward and turned her face into the wind. Mom. That night she sat at the kitchen table after Grant had gone upstairs, and she wrote in the margins of her paper, updating her numbers. The contract, if it came through as she'd proposed it, changed everything about the timeline. Guaranteed volume from 3 camps, even at conservative estimates, was enough to clear the banknote in 6 weeks instead of 15. It also meant she needed more help. Hector and Pete couldn't manage 3 camps, and she couldn't run the ranch kitchen and the supply operation simultaneously without something breaking. She needed to think about labor. She sat there thinking, and the range ticked as it cooled and the wind found the window frame again, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted in its stall, and the house was very quiet around her. It was the quietest it had been since she arrived. She realized with some surprise that she didn't find the quiet unpleasant anymore. When she'd first come, the silence of the ranch at night had felt like a kind of accusation. All this space, all this emptiness, and nothing built yet to fill it. Now it felt like room to think, room to plan, room to make something out of what had looked 2 weeks ago like nothing at all. She closed the margin notes and put the pencil down and went to bed. The next morning she was up at 4. Hargrove's secretary came back in 4 days, not 7. Evelyn was in the middle of the morning service when she saw the buggy pull up at the edge of the camp. The same hired rig from Harlow's only livery. The secretary in his city coat looking profoundly out of place against the mud and the equipment noise. He stood at a distance with his leather case held against his chest and waited, which told her something about how the week had gone on Hargrove's end. Men who had the advantage did not wait at a polite distance. Men who had been told to come back quickly and get this done stood exactly like that. She finished the line first. This was not calculation on her part, or not entirely. There were still 60 men waiting, and they'd come before the secretary, and they were owed what they'd come for. But she was also aware, in the back of her working mind, that arriving at a negotiation slightly unhurried was never the wrong posture. She handed the ladle to Hector and wiped her hands and walked over. "Mrs. Calloway," the secretary said. His name was Pruitt. She'd gotten that much the first time. "Mr. Hargrove has reviewed your proposed amendments. And—" He opened the leather case and produced a document that was noticeably longer than the original contract. She took it. He had a pen ready. "I'd like to read it first," she said. Pruitt looked pained. Of course. She read it standing up, which was not comfortable, but which she preferred to the alternative of sitting somewhere Pruitt designated, in whatever chair made her feel like a supplicant. The revised contract was 4 pages now, and she went through it with the same patience she'd applied the first time. And when she reached paragraph 7, she stopped. The exclusivity clause had been rewritten. It was now mutual. She couldn't sell to competing operations within 30 miles. But the company couldn't bring in another vendor to her designated camps without 60 days' notice and a buyout provision that would cost them more than the clause was worth to enforce. It wasn't everything she'd asked for. 30 miles was tighter than she'd wanted. But it was symmetrical, which was the point. Paragraph 11 was gone. In its place was a fixed pricing schedule running 14 weeks, the full remaining project timeline, with a renewal option at mutual agreement. The termination notice had been extended to 45 days. Not 60, but close. She looked at the last page. There was a new clause she hadn't seen before, near the bottom, in smaller type than the rest. She read it twice. It was an option clause. At the end of the 14-week term, the Continental Rail Construction Company retained the right of first offer on any expanded catering operation Evelyn might establish, at terms to be negotiated at that time. She looked up at Pruitt. "Paragraph 14, she said. "The option clause." "Standard for extended vendor relationships," he said carefully. "It gives your company first claim on any future business I build. Right of first offer only. You're not obligated to accept. But I'm obligated to offer, which means if I want to take another deal, I have to bring it to you first and give you the chance to match or beat it." She tapped the page. "That's a constraint on my future negotiating position, Mr. Pruitt." He adjusted his coat. Mr. Hargrove felt it was a reasonable— "Tell Mr. Hargrove I'll accept the option clause with a modification. The right of first offer applies only to operations that directly service Continental Rail camps. Any other business I develop— town operations, private clients, whatever else, is entirely outside the clause." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man doing mental arithmetic about whether he had authority to agree to this on his employer's behalf. "I have a pen," she said. "The modification is 2 sentences. We can handwrite it into the margin right now, initial it, and both parties have a signed agreement today. Or you can go back to Mr. Hargrove and I'll keep selling to this camp at my current prices with no contract at all, which is the situation we're both trying to move past." Pruitt looked at the contract. He looked at her. He was not a foolish man. She'd formed that opinion early. But he was a man who was not used to being cornered politely, and the politeness was making it harder for him to locate the exit. 2 sentences, he said. 2 sentences, she confirmed. He thought about it for another moment. Then he produced a second pen from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She wrote the modification in the margin of paragraph 14, clearly and in full, and initialed it. and handed the pen back to him. He read what she'd written, and then he signed. She signed beneath him. He took the contract and produced a copy. She'd half expected there would be no copy, which would have been its own kind of message, and handed her the duplicate. "Mr. Hargrove said to tell you," Pruitt said, tucking the signed original into his leather case, "that he looks forward to a productive arrangement." "Tell him the same," she said. She watched the buggy turn and head back toward the Harlow Road, and she stood in the cold air holding her copy of the contract, and she felt not triumph exactly. Triumph felt too clean. What she felt was something more like the satisfaction of having done a hard thing correctly, which was its own particular quality of feeling, quieter and more durable than triumph and considerably more useful. She folded the contract and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the serving line. "Everything all right?" Hector asked, without looking up from the Dutch oven. "We have a contract," she said. He looked up then. "A good one?" "Better than the one they started with." He nodded and went back to the ladle. She picked up the coffee pot and started moving down the line. The 14-week contract changed the geometry of everything. It wasn't just the money, though the money was real and substantial, and its arrival in the operational account produced in Grant a visible physical relief that she found genuinely moving to watch. The slight loosening across his shoulders, the way he sat a little differently at the kitchen table when she spread the weekly numbers in front of him. It was that the contract converted what had been an improvised emergency measure into something with a structure, a timeline, a definable endpoint. You could plan around a contract. You couldn't plan around a hope. She needed labor, which she'd known was coming. The 3-camp arrangement meant she couldn't be physically present at all locations simultaneously, and Hector and Pete were already at capacity running the primary camp while she managed the supply chain and the ranch kitchen. It was Pete who solved part of the problem, without being asked. He came to her on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands. She noticed men did that when they were about to say something they weren't sure would be well received, and he said, "There's 2 women in town I think you should talk to." She looked up from her ledger. "Tell me." "Dorothy Plum. Her husband died last spring, left her with 4 kids and a house she can't afford. She used to cook for the Gideon boarding house before it closed." He turned his hat once. "And Ruth Archer. She's older, maybe 50. Her husband left. Just left, took the horse, and didn't come back. And she's been taking in laundry, but it's not enough." Evelyn sat with that. "You know these women. Dorothy's sister was friendly with my mother," he said. "I grew up knowing the family, and Ruth Archer makes the best biscuits in Harlow County. I know that from personal experience." "Pete, ma'am." "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at the floor, then at her. "Because they need work and you need help, and it seemed like the kind of thing you'd want to know." She studied him. He was 20 years old and still had the sunburn across his nose and the ears that stuck out. And he was right. It was exactly the kind of thing she wanted to know. She'd been trying to figure out the labor problem for a week, and she'd been thinking about it wrong, looking at it as an operational deficit rather than as what it actually was. An opportunity to bring people in who needed what she had to offer, which was work and a wage and a reason to get up in the morning. "Set up a meeting," she said. "Both of them. Tomorrow, if you can." "What?" Dorothy Plum was 31 and had the look of someone who had been through a great deal in a short time and was still surprised by how much of herself remained. She came to the ranch kitchen with her oldest daughter, a serious 8-year-old who sat in the corner and watched everything with round, dark eyes. Dorothy shook Evelyn's hand with a firm grip and sat down and said, before Evelyn could begin, "I need to know what the pay is and when I'd be paid." Evelyn liked her immediately. "Weekly," Evelyn said. "Every Saturday. 12 cents a day for the camp runs, which are 5 days. I need someone who can prep in the evenings here at the ranch and serve in the mornings at the secondary camp. Hector runs the primary. I need someone solid at the secondary." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "I've got children." "I know. The prep work is evenings, which means your children can be here while you work. The morning runs are early. You'd leave by 5 and be back before midday. Who watches the children those mornings?" "That we'd have to work out." She paused. "Is there a neighbor?" "Mrs. Garrett next door owes me 6 months of favors," Dorothy said. "I think she'd sit with them for a fair trade." "Then talk to Mrs. Garrett." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen. Her daughter in the corner was watching the range with an expression of concentrated interest. 12 cents a day, Dorothy said. 5 days. Plus meals while you're working. Dorothy looked at her. When do I start? Ruth Archer was a different conversation, and a harder one. She was 52 and had been on her own for 3 years, and she had, during those 3 years, developed a thorough and well-reasoned distrust of arrangements that sounded better than they turned out to be. She sat at the same kitchen table 2 hours later and asked questions that Evelyn had not expected from Dorothy. Specific questions about the contract, about the company she was dealing with, about what happened to the workers' wages if the operation contracted or ended. If the railroad contract ends, Evelyn said, I'm building toward a town operation that doesn't depend on the railroad. The camp work is funding the next stage. What's the next stage? Ruth asked. A proper dining hall in Harlow, permanent, year-round. Ruth looked at her with the flat-eyed evaluation of a woman who had heard promises before. You've got capital for that. Not yet. In 6 weeks I will. That's a lot of steps between here and there. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. Ruth was quiet. She looked at the range. The same way Dorothy's daughter had looked at it, Evelyn noticed, which made her wonder what people saw in a working range that made them look at it like that. Maybe it was just the fact that it was warm. I make better biscuits than anything you've got on that menu, Ruth said. Pete Dunmore told me. Ruth's expression shifted. Pete Dunmore is a nosy boy with big ears. He's a useful one. Evelyn paused. If your biscuits are as good as he says, I'd want them on the menu inside a week. They're better than he says, Ruth said. He's not sophisticated enough to appreciate what he's eating. Evelyn almost laughed. When can you start? Tempt. The secondary camp was 12 miles north of the primary. A smaller crew, 140 men, working a section of track that would eventually connect to the main line. The foreman there was a quiet man named Sorensen, who had none of Odell's territorial posturing and who accepted the authorized vendor documentation from Pruitt's office with a nod and a handshake and showed Dorothy where the fire pit was. By the end of the first week with Dorothy and Ruth in operation, the numbers looked like this. Primary camp, 220 to 250 plates daily. Secondary camp, 90 to 110. Combined weekly gross, slightly under $60. The feed merchant's debt was cleared in week 3. Evelyn paid it in person, in cash, and she watched Caldwell count it twice and then look at her with a revised expression that she didn't particularly need, but didn't mind. The blacksmith got his $40 the same day. You didn't have to come yourself, Earl the blacksmith said. He was a big, gentle man with a permanently ash-gray complexion from the forge, and he seemed genuinely flustered by her presence. You were patient when you didn't have to be, she said. That deserved a personal thank you. He looked at the money in his hand. I'll reshoe those 2 horses whenever you're ready, he said. No charge. That's not necessary. I know it isn't, he said. I'm offering anyway. She let him. It was in week 4 that the trouble started. It didn't announce itself as trouble. It arrived in the form of a man named Colton Briggs, no relation to Tom, who showed up at the primary camp on a Wednesday morning with a cart and 2 boys and a setup that was, Evelyn saw immediately, designed to compete directly with hers. He'd positioned himself 30 yards from her wagon. He was selling salt pork sandwiches and coffee at 4 cents apiece, which was a cent cheaper than her breakfast. He was loud about it, calling out prices to the men in the line, and he had a practiced grin that suggested he'd done this kind of thing before. Evelyn watched him from the wagon. Hector said quietly, You want me to say something to Odell? No, she said. He's cutting into our line. I know. She studied Colton Briggs's setup. The cart was a good one, well built. The boys working it were efficient. The salt pork sandwiches were, she could see this from where she stood, thick cut and generous. He wasn't a fool. He'd done his math on the 4-cent price point, and he could sustain it probably for a while. What he's selling is cheaper and simpler, she said. A sandwich is faster than a plate. Some of these men are going to go to him. So what do? She thought for a moment. We make what we're selling worth more than the difference. She opened the second Dutch oven. Ruth's biscuits had been a feature since day 5, golden brown and dense and better than advertised, and she began calling out to the men in the line with specifics. Not just hot breakfast, but what was in it this morning. The beef hash she'd started adding dried peppers to after Hector had told her about his mother's cooking. The corn cakes with a touch of rendered fat that gave them a crispness that simple cornbread never had, and Ruth's biscuits, which had acquired a reputation in the camp that Evelyn had not manufactured but was happy to confirm. By mid-morning, the line at Colton Briggs's cart was shorter than her own. Briggs himself walked over at the end of service while she was cleaning up. He was not hostile. He had the ease of a man who operated in competition regularly and considered it neither personal nor particularly meaningful. "Good operation," he said. "So is yours. You've got the contract." "I do." He nodded. He looked at the Dutch oven. "The biscuits are what got them," he said. "It was observation, not complaint. I could smell them from 30 yards. "That's the intention," she said. He almost smiled. "You're not worried about me." "I'm always slightly worried," she said honestly, "but I'm more focused on making what I have better than on managing what you do." He looked at her for a moment. "You know, if you ever wanted to bring another vendor into the secondary camp, I'd be interested in talking." She looked at him. This was unexpected. "You'd work under a subcontract." "Depends on the terms." She thought about it. The secondary camp was Dorothy's territory, and Dorothy was solid, but Dorothy had 4 children, and the early mornings were visibly wearing on her. A second vendor at the secondary camp, properly structured, could allow Dorothy to shift to the evening prep schedule exclusively, which would be better for Dorothy and probably better for the product. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's more than I expected," Briggs said, and tipped his hat, and went back to his cart. The conversation with Grant that night was the most honest they'd had. She hadn't planned it. She was going through the week's numbers at the kitchen table, and he came in from the barn later than usual, smelling of hay and cold air. And instead of going upstairs, he sat down across from her and looked at the papers. "Can I see?" he said. She turned the ledger toward him. He looked at it for a long time. His expression was doing several things at once that she had learned, over 4 weeks, to partially read. There was the relief, which she'd seen before. There was something else tonight, a more complicated thing that had to do, she suspected, not just with the numbers, but with what the numbers represented. "The banknote," he said. "At this rate, 6 weeks. Maybe 5. He looked up. 5 weeks. If the secondary camp volume holds, and if I bring Colton Briggs in as a subcontractor at the secondary, that frees Dorothy up for prep exclusively and should actually increase the morning output." Grant set the ledger down. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. "You know," he said, "when I wrote those letters, the ones to the agency." He stopped. She waited. "I knew they weren't accurate," he said. I told myself it was close enough, that the situation could change before whoever came arrived." He paused. "It was a lie, not a complicated one, just a lie." She looked at him. "I know. I know you know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm saying it because I haven't said it directly, and you deserve to have me say it directly weeks ago." She was quiet for a moment. The range clicked. The wind found the window frame. "Why did you need someone?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Margaret, my first wife, she died in the winter 2 years back," he said finally. "Fever. 2 days, and she was gone." He kept his eyes on the table. "I didn't handle it well. I stopped being able to see the point of most things. The ranch fell apart around me because I let it, and by the time I came back to myself enough to look at what I'd done, the debt was too big, and I didn't know how to start." "So you decided to find someone to help," she said. "I decided to find someone," he said. "I wasn't sure what I needed. I just knew I couldn't do it alone anymore." "That's honest. It's embarrassing is what it is." He said it quietly. Not self-pity, just assessment. She looked at him across the table. He was a different person than the man who had picked up her trunk in Harlow 4 weeks ago. Or maybe the same person with some of the closed doors slightly open. "You should know," she said, "that I didn't come here with a lot of better options. I came because the arrangement was practical and because I needed something too." She paused. "I don't say that to make you feel better. I say it because it's true, and you should have the whole picture." He looked up. "What did you need?" "A place," she said. Somewhere to build something. My options in the East were limited. She let that sit. The reasons aren't important. The point is that neither of us came into this from a position of strength, and that's probably all right. Most things that end up being real don't start that way. He held her gaze for a moment. The lamp on the table was burning low, and the light was warm and uneven, and outside the wind had picked up, and the pines behind the barn were making the sound they made in a real gust, a sustained, low sound like water moving. "The garden," he said finally. "What about it?" "Margaret's garden, out back. I let it go for 2 years." He picked up the ledger, not to look at it, just to have something in his hands. "Tom Briggs has been wanting to clear it. Says it looks bad, the dead growth." "Does it need to be cleared?" she said carefully. He set the ledger down again. "No," he said. "It needs to be worked." She looked at him. "In the spring," he said. "If you wanted to." She understood what he was asking, not about the garden exactly, or not only about the garden. "In the spring," she said. He nodded and stood up and said goodnight and went upstairs. She sat at the table for a while after. She looked at the numbers in the ledger and she looked at the window where the dark was pressing and she thought about the word home and how long it usually took a place to start meaning that, and whether 4 weeks was too soon or whether 4 weeks of what she'd been through here had the density of a much longer time. She thought it might be the latter. She closed the ledger and turned down the lamp. Hargrove came back in week 5. Not with Pruitt this time. He came himself, alone except for a driver, and he arrived at the primary camp at mid-morning when the service was winding down and the cleanup was underway. He accepted a cup of coffee from Hector without asking for it and walked over to where Evelyn was reviewing the morning's count. "The secondary camp operation," he said by way of greeting. "Good morning," she said. He almost smiled. "Good morning. The secondary camp. I've been hearing good things. Dorothy Plum runs it well. I've been hearing about volume. The plate count is up 30% from last month. We refined the menu and added a second vendor under subcontract." He looked at her. "You subcontracted within your own arrangement. The contract doesn't prohibit it." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He sipped the coffee. He looked at the Dutch oven like he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with the Dutch oven. "The project finishes in 9 weeks." "I know. After that, this camp closes. This crew disperses to the next project, which is 400 miles west." "I know that too." He turned and looked at her directly. "What are your plans when the camp closes?" She had been expecting this question. She'd been expecting it since Pruitt had come back with the revised contract and the option clause, which she now understood had been Hargrove's way of keeping a door open. "I'm building a permanent operation in Harlow," she said. "Dining hall, open to the public. I have a building in mind on the north end of Main Street." "That's local scale," he said. "To start." He looked at her for a moment. "I have a proposal," he said. "Not a contract, a conversation. I'm listening." "The company is pushing 3 more lines through this territory over the next 2 years. Different crews, different locations, but the same supply problem. Men working hard with inadequate food. I could use someone who already knows how to do what you do at scale across multiple sites." She held very still. "That's a different proposition than a single camp," she said. "Considerably different." He looked out at the camp. "The woman I contracted with 6 weeks ago to feed one crew is not the same operation as a regional catering concern for multiple rail projects. The capital requirements are different. The logistics are different. The risk is different," she said. "Yes." He turned back. "But I've watched you negotiate, Mrs. Calloway, and I've watched you operate. The risk calculus might look different from where you're standing than it does from where I'm standing." She was quiet. She looked at the camp, the equipment, the tents, the men moving through the cold air, all of it representing a scale she'd had no framework for 6 weeks ago when she'd pulled the wagon over on the North Road and done the arithmetic in her head. "I'm not in a position to give you an answer today," she said. "I'm not asking for one," he said. "I'm starting a conversation." "Then we'll continue it," she said. He drank the last of his coffee and handed the cup back to Hector and walked back to his carriage. Hector watched him go. "What was that about?" he said. "The future," Evelyn said. "Probably." She picked up the count ledger. "Let's finish the cleanup." He took the cup back to the wash basin. She looked at the page in front of her, and below the morning's numbers she wrote 2 words in the margin, circled them the same way she'd circled opportunity on that first night at the kitchen table. What next? She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the ledger and began breaking down the service setup with Hector, and the cold air moved through the camp around them, and the pines on the ridge bent slightly in the wind, and the morning continued in the imperfect, busy, ordinary way that mornings did when there was too much work to do to stop and admire what you'd built, which suited her fine. She'd always worked better moving forward than standing still. The banknote was paid on a Thursday morning in the 6th week, and it did not feel the way Evelyn had imagined it would. She'd imagined, in the margins of the nights when she couldn't sleep, when she was running numbers for the 100th time, that it would feel like a door opening, like standing on the other side of something that had been blocking her view. She'd thought there might be a moment of genuine lightness, the kind that came when a weight you'd been carrying so long, you'd stopped noticing it was finally set down. What she felt instead was tired, not defeated, tired, not even unhappy tired. Just the specific exhaustion of a person who had been operating at the outer edge of their capacity for 6 weeks straight, and whose body had apparently decided that the banknote was a reasonable place to finally submit the bill. She handed the certified payment to the clerk at the Harlow Savings and Loan, a thin man named Graves, who had the careful politeness of someone who had expected a different outcome and was now adjusting. And she waited while he counted it, and stamped the receipt and wrote something in his ledger in a hand so small it was nearly illegible. "This concludes the note," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." She took the receipt. She folded it in thirds and put it in her coat pocket next to the copy of the railroad contract. She thanked Graves, who was too surprised to respond with anything more than a nod, and she walked out onto Harlow's main street into a cold November morning that looked exactly like every other cold November morning, and meant now something entirely different. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Down the street, past the general store and the post office and the saloon with its still-busted shutter, there was a building that had been empty for 14 months. It was 2 stories, frame construction, solid-looking from the outside, which was all she'd seen of it so far. The former owner had run a boarding house that had failed when the Gideon family sold their mine operation and the workers left the area. The building had sat empty since then, and the family that held the property had been trying to unload it long enough that their asking price had come down 3 times. She looked at it now. She had the bank receipt in one pocket and 4 weeks left on the railroad contract, and Hargrove's conversation sitting in the back of her mind like something she kept walking past and not yet deciding to pick up. She had Dorothy Plum and Ruth Archer and Hector and Pete and a subcontracting arrangement with Colton Briggs that was producing better secondary camp numbers than she'd projected. She had Tom Briggs rebuilding the bunkhouse roof with lumber she'd been able to buy with 3 weeks' profit, and she had 2 new calves born since October that Tom had told her, with the cautious optimism of a man who had learned not to count things too early, were looking healthy. She had, in short, something that looked almost exactly like the foundation of a real operation. The building at the end of the street was the next step. She'd known it since week 2, and she'd been patient about it in the way she was learning to be patient about the steps that required money she didn't yet have, not ignoring them, just keeping them in the category of next rather than now until the moment shifted. The moment had shifted. She walked to the end of the street. The building was worse inside than outside, which she'd expected, and better structured than it looked, which she hadn't. The main floor was a single long room that had been the boarding house dining area. The kitchen was through a door at the back, larger than the ranch kitchen, with 2 ranges and a brick hearth and a water pump directly at the sink, which was a luxury she felt embarrassingly moved by. The second floor was 5 small rooms that had been boarder quarters, all of them empty and dusty and smelling of old wood and something floral and long gone. The family's representative was a young man named Price, who had come from Cheyenne specifically for this meeting and who was visibly relieved that she was there and had the demeanor of someone who needed this transaction to happen. "Foundation is solid," he said, which was the first thing people said about a building when the foundation was the only thing they were confident about. "I can see that," she said. She was looking at the kitchen hearth. The mortar was cracked in 2 places along the left side, which was manageable, and the second range had a warped grate, which was not ideal but was fixable. "The ranges need work. The roof, What's the roof situation? Some soft spots near the east eave, Price said. We'd account for that in the price. I'd want to know the number before we discuss the price. They went back and forth for an hour. She'd been told the asking price by the land office clerk in October, $220. And she knew it had come down since, and she knew approximately what Price needed to walk away from this feeling like he hadn't been beaten, which was a different number than the actual floor. They agreed on $180. She put $50 down from the operating account and structured the remainder as a 6-week note against the projected dining hall revenue, which Price was not entirely comfortable with, but which she'd prepared documentation for. The railroad contract, the current weekly revenue figures, the projected forward numbers, and which, presented in organized form on paper rather than stated verbally, had the effect of making an unconventional arrangement look like a reasonable one. She walked out with a deed of sale and a 6-week payment schedule, and she went directly to the post office and wrote 2 letters, one to Ruth Archer, one to Dorothy Plum. Both letters said essentially the same thing. I have a building. I'd like to talk to you about what comes next. Come to the ranch Saturday. Saturday brought both of them, and also, unexpectedly, a woman neither Evelyn nor Pete had mentioned. Dorothy arrived with her oldest daughter in tow as always. The girl, whose name was Clara, had taken to sitting in the ranch kitchen corner with a piece of paper and a pencil and drawing things, which Evelyn found quietly charming. Ruth arrived with her usual punctuality and her usual expression of contained skepticism about whatever was about to happen. And behind Ruth, coming up the ranch road in a wagon that had seen better years, was a woman Evelyn didn't recognize. She was perhaps 45, solid through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors. She climbed down from the wagon without help and looked at Evelyn directly. I heard you were hiring, she said. Who told you that? Evelyn said. Earl at the blacksmith. She extended her hand. Agnes Furl. I cooked for the Dearborn Hotel for 11 years until the new owner brought in his brother-in-law and decided he didn't need me anymore. Evelyn shook her hand. How much notice did he give you? 3 days. What did you do after? Took in mending, hated every minute of it. Agnes looked at the ranch house, then at the outbuildings, then back at Evelyn. I'm a better cook than whoever you've currently got. I'm the one I've currently got, Evelyn said. Agnes considered this. I'm a better cook than most people, she amended. Come inside, Evelyn said. We're having a meeting. The 4 of them sat around the ranch kitchen table, Clara in her corner with her paper, and Evelyn laid out what she had. The building, the note, the projected revenue. She was straightforward about what was real and what was projection, because she'd learned in 6 weeks that women who had been managing difficult circumstances on their own were specifically sensitive to the difference between honest uncertainty and dressed-up optimism. And the fastest way to lose their trust was to present a plan as more certain than it was. The dining hall can seat 30 to 35, she said. That's lunch and dinner service 6 days a week. The lunch crowd would be working men and passing trade. Dinner is where the real margin lives if we can get families in. She paused. I want each of you to have a defined role with a defined wage, not piecework, not day rates that disappear when business is slow, actual wages paid weekly. Ruth said, What are the wages? Evelyn told them. It was not a large number. She was not in a position to offer large numbers yet. But it was consistent and it was real, and it was, she had made sure, above what any of them were currently making. Dorothy looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at Evelyn. I want to see the kitchen before I agree to anything, Agnes said. That's reasonable, Evelyn said. They went to Harlow that afternoon, all 4 of them in Evelyn's wagon, and they walked through the building on Main Street, and Agnes went to the kitchen and looked at the ranges and the hearth and the water pump and the ceiling and the floor, and she said nothing for several minutes, which Evelyn understood to be the process of a professional making an actual assessment rather than a performative one. The grate on the second range, Agnes said. That's a simple replacement. Hardware in Dearborn would have the part. I know. The mortar on the hearth needs to be repointed before you run a heavy fire through it. I know that too. Agnes looked at the water pump. She worked the handle twice. Water came out. She looked at Evelyn. This is a real kitchen, she said. It was not quite a compliment. It was more like a statement of surprised fact. Yes, Evelyn said. Agnes was quiet for another moment. Then she said, All right, They opened the Harlow Dining Hall on a Monday in the 7th week of the railroad contract. It was not a grand opening. Evelyn had neither the money nor the temperament for grand openings. She had Agnes and Ruth in the kitchen, Dorothy managing the front of the house, and Pete doing everything else, which included carrying things, fixing things, and standing at the door with what Evelyn had told him was his job. Make everyone who comes in feel like they were expected. What does that mean? He'd asked. It means look at them when they walk in, say hello, ask if they've been in before. If they have, try to remember something about them. I'm terrible at remembering names. Then remember something else. What they ordered, where they said they were from. People don't need you to remember their name. They need to feel like they're not invisible. He'd thought about this seriously, which was one of the things she genuinely valued about Pete Dunmore. He took instructions seriously without taking it personally. The first day they served 41 lunches and 23 dinners. This was not a triumph by any measure, but it was enough to cover the day's food cost with something left over, and more importantly, it was enough to generate the word of mouth that any new establishment lived or died on. Agnes's cooking was, Evelyn confirmed on that first day, considerably better than she had described it herself, which she had not thought was likely. The beef roast at dinner had 3 men asking Ruth at the front whether they could bring their wives on Friday. Ruth told them, of course they could. She said it with the warmth of a woman who had been deprived of professional dignity for 3 years and was finding it again and was careful not to show how much it meant, which was exactly the right instinct. Evelyn watched her from across the room and thought that Ruth Archer was probably the best hire she'd made, which was a competitive field by this point. The second week, the lunch count hit 60. The dinner count hit 40 on Friday, when the 3 men brought their wives, and then several more people came in behind them because they'd seen the lights and the activity through the window and had the particular curiosity of people in small towns when anything new appears to be working. By the end of the second week, the dining hall was making more per day than the railroad camp service, and the railroad contract still had 2 weeks left to run. Evelyn went back to the ranch on a Thursday evening in the 8th week and found Grant in the barn again, which was where he spent the hours after the day's work was done. Not because there was always something to do in the barn, though there usually was, but because she'd come to understand that the barn was where he went to think. The rhythm of working with his hands in a quiet space was how he processed things. She hadn't interrupted it before. She did now. She came in and leaned against the post nearest the door and said, I need to talk to you about something. He looked up from the leather work in his hands. All right. Hargrove made a proposal. Weeks ago. I've been sitting on it. She told him, all of it, the scope of what Hargrove had outlined, the capital requirements she'd been privately estimating, the risk structure as she understood it, the ways it could expand what they were doing, and the ways it could also consume everything they'd built if it went wrong. Grant listened the way he always listened, still not giving anything away. When she finished, he set down the leather. He looked at the barn floor for a moment. You said you've been sitting on this for weeks, he said. Yes. Why? She considered the honest answer. Because it's large enough that I didn't want to bring it to you until I knew how I felt about it myself. And because... She paused. Because it would change the ranch, not just the operation. The ranch. What we're spending our time on. What we're managing. It would be a different life than the one we're currently building. He looked at her. Is that a bad thing? I don't know yet. That's why I'm telling you now. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for permission. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because it affects you and because you deserve to know. But I also... She stopped. What? She was not good at this part. She was good at numbers and logistics and reading contracts and managing people and making decisions under uncertainty. She was less practiced at the particular vulnerability of saying, I want your opinion because I value it, which was a different thing from I need your approval, and the difference mattered. I want to know what you think, she said. Your actual opinion, not what you think I want to hear. Grant looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the leatherwork again, not to continue with it, but just to have something in his hands, which she'd noticed was a habit of his when he was thinking seriously. I think you already know what you want to do, he said. You've been carrying this for weeks, and you're not the kind of person who carries things for weeks without having worked them through. She didn't deny it. I think, he said carefully, that it's a real risk and that you know it better than I do. I know cattle and land and weather. I don't know railroad contracts and regional supply chains. He paused. But I know you've been right about every decision you've made since you got here, including the ones I was skeptical about. You weren't skeptical about the first camp run, she said. You said all right. I was completely skeptical, he said. I just trusted you more than I trusted my own skepticism. She looked at him. That's a different thing, he said, than permission. That's just honesty. She stood with that for a moment. Outside the barn, the wind was doing the thing it did in late November. Not the sharp, cutting cold of early winter, but the settled, deep cold that meant the season had committed. The horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere in the near field, one of the new calves made a sound. The ranch, she said. What I want is for the ranch to be solid first, before anything else expands. I want the debt gone, all of it. And I want the herd rebuilt to a number where it's self-sustaining, and I want the bunkhouse finished and the fencing on the east pasture repaired. She listed these things not as conditions, but as facts, the shape of what she needed before she could in good conscience say yes to something larger. Tom thinks the herd could be at 35 head by spring if we buy right. He told me the same thing, Grant said. He's already got his eye on a string of cattle from the Pearson outfit west of Dearborn. Pearson's selling down because of his age. What's his price? Grant told her. It was manageable. Just. Can you negotiate him down 10%? She said. Probably. Then do that. She pushed off the post. I'm going to write to Hargrove next week. Tell him I'm interested in the conversation continuing. Not that I'm saying yes, that I'm interested. Grant nodded. Then he said, without looking up from the leather, the garden. She stopped. I started clearing it today, he said. The dead growth. Tom helped me for an hour before lunch. He kept his eyes on the work in his hands. There's more good soil under there than I expected, considering how long I let it go. She looked at the side of his face. The lamplight was low and warm and uneven, and he was not a man who said more than he meant, which meant that the garden was not entirely about the garden. I'll look at it in the morning, she said, if you want. I want, she said, and went back to the house. The railroad contract ended on a Friday in the 9th week, and the last morning service at the primary camp had a quality that Evelyn hadn't anticipated. The men knew it was the last day. Word had moved through the camp the way word always moved through a community of people who had been living in close quarters for months, quickly, incompletely, and with emotional weight that surprised even the people feeling it. Several of the regulars shook her hand. Olafsson, the big Swede who had always asked for extra corn cake, stood at the end of the line and said, in his careful, deliberate English, "You made this better. Every morning, you made it better." He said it like he'd rehearsed it, which she suspected he had, and it was the best thing anyone had said to her in months. Even Odell, the foreman who had crossed his arms at her the very first morning and said I didn't authorize any outside vendors, came by at the end of service. He didn't say much. He held out a tin cup for the last of the coffee and said, "Good operation," which was exactly what Colton Briggs had said weeks earlier, and which, she was realizing, was what men in this territory said when they meant something considerably larger. "Thank you for getting out of the way on that first day," she said. Odell looked briefly startled. Then something moved across his face that might have been sheepishness. "The smell," he said, "couldn't exactly stop 300 men from following their noses." She let him have that. Hector and Pete broke down the setup for the last time and loaded the wagon in relative silence. There was nothing particularly sad about it. The dining hall was open and doing well, and the money from the contract had rebuilt the operational account to a level that still surprised her when she looked at it. But there was a specific quality to endings even when the ending was the right one, and she felt it as they drove back south toward Harlow. Pete said, after a couple of miles, "What happens to Hector now?" "Hector is the dining hall lunch cook starting Monday," she said. "Agnes handles dinner service, Hector handles lunch, Ruth manages the front of the house. Dorothy does prep every morning." Pete was quiet. "And me." She glanced at him. He was 20 years old and he'd grown noticeably in the 9 weeks she'd known him. Not taller, but in the way people grew when they were given real work and real responsibility and were trusted to do it. His ears still stuck out. The sunburn had faded with the season. "You're the ranch," she said. "You and Tom. I need 2 people I trust out there full time now that the camp runs are over. The herd is expanding and Tom can't do it alone." He sat with that. "Ranch work," he said. "Is that not what you want?" "No." "Yes, it is." He readjusted his grip on the reins. "I just wasn't sure where I fit." "You fit where you're trusted," she said. "That's how it works. You've earned it." He nodded, and she could see that it mattered to him, and she didn't diminish it by saying anything else. She wrote to Hargrove on a Saturday, 2 weeks after the contract closed. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. Not because she was uncertain about the content, but because the letter had to do several things at once: express genuine interest without sounding eager, ask specific questions about operational structure without revealing the full extent of her analysis, and establish, in tone and in the specificity of her questions, that whoever was reading this was dealing with someone who had done the homework. The final letter was 1 page. It asked 4 questions. It proposed a meeting in Cheyenne at his convenience in the new year, which was 6 weeks out, which gave her 6 weeks to have the dining hall producing consistent numbers she could bring to that meeting as evidence. Grant read it before she sent it. She'd started doing this not because she needed his approval, but because she found that having someone she trusted read something she'd written was a useful check against her own blind spots. "Last paragraph," he'd said. "What about it?" "You sound more certain than you are." She looked at the paragraph. He was right. It was a sentence that claimed confidence she didn't quite feel, and it read as a tell, the specific overstatement of someone trying to project what they didn't yet have. She revised it. He read it again. "Better," he said. She sent it. December settled over the ranch with the seriousness that Wyoming December required, and the days took on a different rhythm than the frantic 9 weeks of the camp operation. There was still the dining hall. She was in Harlow 6 days a week, in the kitchen or managing the books or talking to Agnes about the next week's menu. But there was also, for the first time since she'd arrived, something that resembled ordinary life. She started going out to Margaret's garden in the mornings before she left for town. Grant had cleared it, as he'd said, and what remained was a rough rectangle of dark soil that was frozen now, but would be workable in April. He'd pulled up the dead growth carefully, not ripping it out, but cutting it, leaving the roots intact where the roots were worth keeping. She could see from what remained which plants had been perennials and which had been annuals, and she found herself planning without quite deciding to plan. Grant came out one morning and found her standing at the edge of the garden with her coat pulled tight. "It's cold to be standing outside looking at dirt," he said. "I'm thinking about what was here and what could be." He came and stood beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth from his coat. He looked at the garden with her. "Margaret planted tomatoes along the south edge," he said. "She said they needed the most sun," he pointed. "Herbs in the middle, where you could get to them without stepping on everything else. She had a system." He was quiet for a moment. "I never paid enough attention to it when she was here." "You could learn it now," Evelyn said. He glanced at her. "I'm not much of a gardener." "You weren't much of a partner in a joint business operation either until recently," she said. She said it without cruelty, just matter of fact, and he received it the same way. "Fair enough," he said. They stood there another minute. The cold was real and the sky was the flat white of December, and the pines behind the barn were dark against it. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, I know this." He stopped, started differently. "What you've built here, what you've done for this ranch, I want you to know I understand it's not. I know it wasn't supposed to be this complicated when you came, when you agreed to the arrangement." She looked at him. "I'm aware that I represented things inaccurately and that you've spent 2 months fixing a situation you didn't create," he said. "And I think about that." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the garden. "I don't know what we are exactly, but I know it's different than what I said in the letters. It's better. And I didn't deserve better, and you gave it anyway, and I'm—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "I'm grateful." It was the most awkward and honest thing she'd heard anyone say in a long time. She stood with it for a moment before answering. "We're building something," she said. "That's what we are, what it turns into. We don't know that yet." She paused. "But I'm not leaving. I told Tom that 2 months ago, and it's still true." He finally looked at her. His eyes in the winter light were the same weathered slate she'd noted the first day on the road from Harlow, but there was something different in them now. Not softness, exactly. Grant was not a soft man, and she didn't want him to be. Something more like presence. Like a man who had stopped being somewhere else. "In the spring," he said, "the garden." "In the spring," she said. "We'll do it together." He nodded. They stood there another moment, the two of them at the edge of the frozen ground. And then the cold made further standing impractical, and they went back inside. And she put coffee on, and he sat at the table with the ledger she'd left there, and looked at the numbers with the ease of a man who had stopped being afraid of them. She watched him for a moment from across the kitchen. She thought about the road from Harlow, 9 weeks ago. The flat assessment on the main street, the already decided story. She thought about the $43 and the marriage certificate and the trunk and the ranch that wasn't what she'd been told it was. She turned back to the range. Outside the kitchen window, the December morning was cold and gray and ordinary, and she had, sitting at her kitchen table, a man who was starting to become something real. And she had, out at the end of Harlow's Main Street, a dining hall with a fire in the hearth and women she'd built something with. And she had, in the coat hanging by the door, a letter she'd sent to a man in Chicago who was considering her for something larger than anything she'd planned when she stepped off the stage. She had built this. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not in the way she'd imagined it when she'd signed the marriage certificate and packed the trunk. But she had built it, and it was real, and it was hers. The coffee began to heat, and the range ticked, and Grant turned a page in the ledger, and the ranch settled around her like something that had always been meant to hold her weight. She stayed at the range and let the morning come. Hargrove's reply came on a Tuesday in the second week of January, and it was not what she'd expected. She'd expected a meeting proposal. A date, a location, the formal architecture of a business conversation between two people who had established that they were worth each other's time. She'd been preparing for that, had been preparing for 6 weeks, in fact, quietly and without telling anyone, building the documentation that would make the Cheyenne meeting something other than a conversation and turn it into a presentation. Revenue figures from the dining hall, projected numbers on the 3-camp expansion, operational cost breakdowns that she'd done and then redone until she trusted them. What she got instead was a letter that was 2 pages long and which changed the shape of everything. She read it at the kitchen table before Grant came down, in the early morning with the lamp turned up and the range just starting to put heat into the room. She read it once quickly and then set it down and sat with it for a moment, and then read it again slowly, the way she read things that required precision. The letter said in the formal and slightly airless prose of a man who had learned to write through lawyers that Warren Hargrove was leaving Continental Rail at the end of February, that he was returning to Chicago for reasons he described only as personal, that before he left, he wanted to resolve the question of the regional catering operation he had proposed because he considered it a real opportunity and did not want it to die with his tenure. The second page was the specific proposal. There was a woman in Denver named Cecilia Voss who had built a catering operation serving 3 railroad lines out of Colorado. She was 61 years old and had been trying to sell the business for 2 years without finding a buyer she considered competent to run it. The operation included contracts with 2 active rail construction projects, a supply warehouse in Denver, 4 wagons, and a staff of 11. Annual revenue, according to the figures Hargrove had included, was approximately $4,000. Hargrove had spoken to Cecilia Voss about Evelyn. Cecilia Voss had agreed to a meeting. The price for the business was $800, which Hargrove described as below market because Voss was more interested in legacy than maximum return. She wanted someone who would run the thing well, not someone who would strip it for parts. Evelyn set the letter down again. $800. She had, at this moment, $240 in the operating account, and another $60 in a separate account she'd begun the previous month for the express purpose of capitalization. $300. Against $800. She was $500 short of an opportunity that would not wait. She sat at the table and did what she always did when a problem was real and large. She worked it. Not emotionally, not with panic, but methodically, the way you approached a contract or a supply calculation. What did she have? What could she access? What was the timeline? The timeline, per the letter, was 6 weeks. Voss had two other interested parties. She had agreed to hold the conversation with Evelyn for 30 days as a courtesy to Hargrove, after which she would proceed with whoever was most ready. 30 days. She was still sitting there when Grant came downstairs. He read the situation off her face before she said a word. She had noticed over the months that he had gotten considerably better at reading her, or possibly she had gotten less guarded, or both. And he sat down across from her without asking any preliminary questions. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it, both pages. He set it down. $800, he said. I have 300. He was quiet. He looked at the table. He looked at the letter. The Pearson cattle, he said. Tom hasn't finalized that purchase yet. I know. She'd thought of that already. If we delay the herd expansion until spring, that's the cattle money still in the account. What were we planning to spend? 120, maybe 130 with transport. That gets me to 420, maybe 430. Still 370 short. Yes. She looked at the letter. The building note comes off in 3 weeks. When that's clear, the dining hall revenue is clean profit. 6 weeks of dining hall at current numbers is, she did it in her head, 180, possibly 200. That's still not 800. I know. She pressed her fingers flat against the table. I need to borrow against the ranch. Grant looked at her. Not the land, she said quickly. I wouldn't ask that, but the equipment, the herd, once we buy it. A short-term note against the dining hall revenue. She met his eyes. I'd be asking you to take on risk that's mine. I want to be honest about that. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be. She had learned not to fill his silences, which was one of the adjustments she'd made in the months she'd known him. Not a small one for a woman whose mind ran as fast as hers. You've been right every time, he said finally. I was right about things I could control, she said. This is larger. The Voss operation has 11 people in contracts I haven't vetted and a supply warehouse I've never seen. I could be wrong. But you don't think you are. She thought about that honestly. No, she said. I don't think I am, but I've thought that before and been surprised by what I missed. He looked at the letter one more time. What do you need from me specifically? Co-signature on a note from Harlow Savings, and Tom to hold off on the cattle purchase until I know what happens with this. Tom's not going to like that. I know. I'll talk to him, Grant said. She looked at him across the table. He was different than he'd been in October. Not a transformed man. She was suspicious of transformed men, or of any story that required a person to become someone entirely new in order to be worth something. He was the same man, but with doors open that had been closed. He was present in a way he hadn't been when she'd first arrived. And presence, she'd come to understand, was the thing that made the difference between a person you lived alongside and a person you actually built something with. Grant, she said. He looked at her. Thank you. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something mattered and he didn't have the words for it, or didn't trust the words he had. And he got up and went to put his coat on and go find Tom Briggs. Well, Tom Briggs did not like it. He made this known in the direct, undecorated way that was his particular style of honesty, standing in the barn with his arms crossed while Grant explained, and then looking at Evelyn, who had come with Grant because she'd decided this was not a conversation to send someone else into on her behalf. The Pearson cattle are ready to move, Tom said. You wait 2 months, Pearson sells to someone else. We lose the herd expansion, and we spend the spring trying to find another string at a worse price. I know, Evelyn said. That's a real cost, and I'm not pretending it isn't. Then why are we doing it? Because the Voss opportunity is worth more than a herd expansion if it works out, and because I need the capital margin. Tom looked at Grant. Grant looked at Tom. Something passed between them that was the language of two men who had known each other a long time. Not agreement exactly, but a mutual acknowledgement that the decision had already been made, and what remained was just the working through. Tom turned back to Evelyn. If this goes sideways, he said. If it goes sideways, we're behind on the herd by 1 season, and I owe an explanation to everyone I've involved, she said. I'm not asking you to pretend the risk isn't real. I'm asking you to hold off for 30 days. Tom looked at the barn floor. He looked at the horses in their stalls. He looked at the space where the old bunkhouse roof had been before he and Pete had fixed it with good lumber in November. 30 days, he said. 30 days. He uncrossed his arms. "All right," he said, which was apparently something the Callaway Ranch ran on. Those two words, in that order, from men who had thought something through and arrived at a conditional trust. She went to Harlow Savings that afternoon. Graves, the clerk, had been replaced in the new year by a younger man named Whitfield, who was considerably less pinched and who, she suspected, had been told about her by Graves before Graves left, because Whitfield greeted her with the specific deference of someone who had done some background research. The note she needed was $400. It was less than the gap because she'd revised her calculations on the dining hall revenue forward into the first 2 weeks of February and was more confident in that number. $400 against the dining hall and the ranch equipment as collateral, repayment structured over 16 weeks beginning February 1st. Whitfield took the documentation she'd brought and read it at his desk, and she sat across from him and waited. It took 20 minutes. He came back with a counter. He wanted a co-signature, and he wanted the note term shortened to 12 weeks. 12 weeks is aggressive against the revenue structure I've shown you, she said. 14 weeks, he said. 14, she agreed. She and Grant both signed. She walked out of Harlow Savings with $400 in certified funds and a 14-week repayment schedule, and she stood on the boardwalk doing the same arithmetic she'd done before, except this time the number worked. $730. Against $800. She was still $70 short. She stood there for a moment. It was January, and the street was half-frozen mud, and the sky was flat and gray, and the busted shutter on the saloon was still hanging at its angle, which apparently nobody had decided was their problem to fix. She thought about who she knew and what she had, and what she could do in the next week that might generate $70 she didn't currently have. She thought about Ruth Archer. Tit-tit. Ruth was at the dining hall when Evelyn came in through the back kitchen door. It was mid-afternoon and the lunch service was done, and Agnes was cleaning the kitchen and Ruth was at the front doing the books, which was a task Evelyn had assigned her 3 weeks ago when she'd discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that Ruth had a better head for figures than she'd let on. "I need to ask you something," Evelyn said. Ruth looked up from the ledger. "You have that face," she said. "What face?" "The face you have when something's complicated and you've already decided, but you need to hear yourself say it out loud." Evelyn sat down across from her. She told Ruth about the letter, the Voss operation, the gap. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was notable because Ruth had opinions on most things and did not typically hold them in reserve. When Evelyn finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much are you short?" $70. Ruth looked at the ledger. She looked at the wall. She looked at Evelyn, with the flat, careful eyes of a woman who had been let down by arrangements before, and who measured the distance between what people said and what they meant with the precision of someone who had learned to do so out of necessity. "I have $85, Ruth said. "Saved over 3 years. It was supposed to be... I had a plan for it. For myself." She stopped. "Lending it would mean trusting that this works." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you the situation because you deserve to know it and because you're part of what I'm trying to build." "You're not asking." "No." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "That's why I'm going to offer," she said. "Because you didn't ask." She opened the ledger drawer and counted out $70 in notes and coin and pushed it across the table. Evelyn looked at it and looked at Ruth. "I'll have this back to you in 12 weeks, she said. "With interest. Real interest. Not a token." "I know you will," Ruth said, and went back to the books as though nothing had happened, which was its own kind of statement. The meeting with Cecilia Voss took place in Denver on a Thursday in the 3rd week of January. Evelyn took the train from Cheyenne, the first time she'd been on a train since coming west, and she sat in the passenger car with her documentation in a leather case she'd borrowed from Grant, and she looked out the window at the landscape moving past, and she thought about the stagecoach from Cheyenne in October, 4 months ago, and the merchant's wife who had told her the frontier was no place for a young woman without family connections. She thought about $43 and a marriage certificate in a trunk. She thought about what it meant that she was on a train to Denver with $730 in certified funds and the clearest understanding she'd ever had of what she was capable of. Cecilia Voss was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined without quite realizing she was imagining it, Someone formidable in the way of older women who had survived decades in hard business. Tough, angular, deliberate. What she found when she was shown into the office of the Voss Catering and Supply Company on a narrow street near the Denver rail yard was a woman who was 61 and small, and who moved with the slight stiffness of someone whose knees had given her trouble for years, and who had the warmest and most direct eyes Evelyn had ever encountered on a person she'd just met. "Hargrove said you were young," Cecilia said, by way of greeting. She was looking at Evelyn the way a person looked at something they were deciding whether to trust. 25, Evelyn said. "He said you were sharp." "I try to be." "Sit down," Cecilia said. "Tell me what you've built." Evelyn sat down and told her. Not from the documentation. She didn't open the leather case for the first 30 minutes. She told it the way it had actually happened, the ranch that wasn't what it was supposed to be, the $43, the first morning at the railroad camp with one Dutch oven and an underestimate of the volume. She told it plainly and without making herself the hero of it, because she'd noticed that people who needed to be the hero of their own story tended to leave out the parts that mattered most. Cecilia listened without taking notes. When Evelyn finished, Cecilia said, "What went wrong?" "Twice I underestimated volume and ran short. Once I underestimated how quickly a competitor could set up adjacent to my operation." She paused. "And in the contract negotiation with Hargrove's company, I missed the option clause on the first read. It was in smaller type, and I was focused on the exclusivity provision. I caught it before signing, but I should have caught it on the first pass." Cecilia looked at her. "Most people wouldn't admit that last one." "Most people would rather look competent than be accurate," Evelyn said. "Those aren't the same thing." A pause. Cecilia folded her hands on the desk. "I've had two other interested parties," she said. "One is a man from St. Louis with more capital than you and less operational experience. The other is a partnership out of Laramie that has the experience but wants to restructure the staff, which I won't allow." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "I built this business with 11 people who stayed because I ran it properly. I won't sell it to someone who'll clear them out in 6 months." "I've hired women who had nowhere else to go," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to fire 11 people who know what they're doing." "How do I know that?" "You don't," Evelyn said. "You know it the same way I know my dining hall is going to pay its note, because the numbers make it rational, and because you've looked at me for an hour and formed an opinion." Cecilia looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "Open the case." Evelyn opened the case. They spent 2 hours on the documentation. Cecilia went through it with the attention of a woman who had been reading operational figures for 30 years and knew immediately when a number was real and when it was optimistic. She asked precise questions and received precise answers, and at 2 points she pushed back hard. On the projected revenue from the expanded camp contracts, which she thought Evelyn had overestimated, and on the staffing model, which she thought was too lean for the supply warehouse operation. On the first point, Evelyn revised the figure downward on the spot and showed Cecilia the revised math. On the second, she acknowledged the gap and asked Cecilia to walk her through the warehouse staffing requirements, which Cecilia did, in detail, and which gave Evelyn more information in 40 minutes than she could have gotten from any other source. At 4 in the afternoon, Cecilia said, "I have a counter on the price." Evelyn waited. $750, in exchange for which I stay on as a consultant for 90 days at no charge. You have questions, you write to me, I answer. After 90 days, you're on your own. $750. She had $730. "I'm $20 short of that number," she said. Cecilia looked at her. "Are you telling me that to be honest or to negotiate?" "To be honest," Evelyn said. "I have $730 in certified funds. I can have the remaining 20 within the week, if that's acceptable." Cecilia studied her for a long moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and produced a contract. Her own, already drafted, which told Evelyn that the decision had been made before Evelyn had walked in the door, and that the 2 hours of documentation review had been confirmation rather than evaluation. "Sign it today," Cecilia said. "Send me the $20 when you have it. I'll give you 30 days. Evelyn looked at the contract. She read every page. She signed it. Odd. She came back to Harlow on a Saturday and went first to the dining hall, not to the ranch. Agnes was in the kitchen and Ruth was at the front, and Dorothy was running the lunch service with the ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it had become natural, rather than effortful. Clara, Dorothy's daughter, was in the kitchen corner. She was always in the kitchen corner on Saturdays, drawing her patient detailed pictures of things she observed, which had lately included increasingly accurate renderings of the ranges and the Dutch ovens, and most recently, a portrait of Agnes that Agnes had hung on the kitchen wall without comment. Evelyn sat at the front table with Ruth and told her. Ruth listened. She asked 2 questions, about the staffing and about the supply warehouse. Both were the right questions, which did not surprise Evelyn. When she was done, Ruth said, "You did it." "We're not clear of the notes yet," Evelyn said. "There's still 14 weeks on the Harlow savings note, and the Voss purchase still has $20 outstanding." "I know." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I said you did it." Evelyn looked at her. "You helped do it." Ruth waved that off with the practicality of a woman who did not need to be credited for things she'd chosen to do. "When do you tell the others?" "Tonight. I'm having everyone out to the ranch." "Agnes won't like coming that far out." "Agnes will come because she's curious," Evelyn said. "She'll complain about the distance the whole way." "That's accurate," Ruth said. "What?" She told them that evening around the ranch kitchen table. Agnes and Ruth and Dorothy, with Clara asleep in the corner on a folded blanket. Hector and Pete and Tom Briggs, who came with his hat in his hands as he always did when he was uncertain of the occasion. Grant sat at the end of the table. She told them what the Voss acquisition meant, not just for her and Grant, but specifically and concretely for each of them. The dining hall was not going anywhere. If anything, the expanded operation needed the dining hall more, as a stable local anchor for a regional supply chain. Agnes's kitchen was the training ground. Ruth's books were the model. Dorothy's lunch service was the proof of concept. Hector was going to manage the supply logistics for the first expanded camp contract, which started in March. He had 2 months to learn the warehouse system, which Cecilia had agreed to walk him through by correspondence. Pete looked at her when she said this. "What about ranch?" he asked. "Ranch needs 2 people through the spring," Tom said, before Evelyn could answer. He'd apparently already thought this through, or talked to Grant, or both. "Pete stays with me. The herd expansion goes ahead in March now that the capital question is resolved. We'll get a decent string from somewhere if Pearson's already sold." "Pearson hasn't sold," Grant said. "I wrote to him last week. He's willing to hold for 30 days if we're serious." Tom looked at Grant. "You wrote to him without telling me." "I'm telling you now," Grant said. Tom made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated something in the specific language of a long acquaintance. Agnes said from the far end of the table, "I have a question." Everyone looked at her. "The Denver warehouse," she said. "The supply operation. 11 people." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Who's running it?" "I'll be in Denver for the first 2 months," Evelyn said. "After that, the plan is to have a manager in place and run it from here with regular travel." Agnes looked at her with the flat, calculating expression she brought to kitchen decisions. "That's a long time to be away from here." "I know. Ruth can run the books. Dorothy's got the service. I can manage the kitchen." Agnes picked up her coffee cup. "But someone needs to handle the suppliers, the ordering, the vendor relationships." She set the cup down. "I've been doing that in the background since we opened. You haven't noticed because I haven't made you notice." Evelyn looked at her. "You're right," she said. "I should have been paying more attention to that." Agnes nodded, satisfied by the acknowledgement. "I want it formal," she said. "Title and wage." "Dining hall manager," Evelyn said. "Wage to be discussed Monday. Seriously." Agnes nodded again and drank her coffee. The evening continued, longer than Evelyn had planned, which was how evenings went when the people in the room had been through enough together that they stopped being colleagues and became something harder to name. Dorothy and Ruth ended up talking in the corner near the range, while Agnes and Tom Briggs had what appeared to be a surprisingly engaged conversation about the optimal temperature for long braise cooking, which was not a conversation Evelyn would have predicted, but which made a certain sense, given that Tom spent more time around the ranch kitchen than anyone except her. Hector sat with Pete at the far end of the table and talked quietly about something she couldn't hear. She watched them for a moment. The 20-year-old with the ears that stuck out, who had driven a wagon through the pre-dawn dark on the first morning because he wanted to help, and the lean, dark-eyed man who had told her about his mother's tamales on the way to camp one morning and had become, without either of them planning it, one of the people she trusted most. She thought about what it meant to build something like this. Not the revenue, and not the contracts, and not the Voss acquisition. Those were real, and they mattered, but they were not the things she was thinking about. She was thinking about the specific fact of these people in this kitchen on a January night in Wyoming who had come from separate difficult circumstances and had found, through the friction and the work and the imperfect daily accumulation of showing up, something that resembled a community. Nobody had given this to them. Nobody had decided they deserved it and handed it over. They'd made it out of the same materials available to anyone, necessity and willingness, and enough trust in each other to keep going through the parts that were hard. That was the thing nobody told you about building something real. They told you about the vision and the risk and the reward, and all of those things were real. But what they didn't tell you was that most of it happened in the unremarkable middle, in the cold early mornings, and the supply calculations and the disagreements that had to be had honestly, and the meals that had to be cooked whether you felt like it or not. The middle was where it was actually built. The beginnings and the endings were just the parts that were easy to describe. Grant came and stood beside her at the edge of the room. He was watching the same thing she was watching. "You're thinking," he said. "I do that sometimes." "I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to Denver for 2 months." "Yes." "That's a long time." She looked at him. There was nothing dramatic in his face. He was not a dramatic man, just the steady presence that had become, over 4 months, one of the things she navigated by. "Come with me," she said, "for the first month. Tom and Pete can manage the ranch. You can see what a supply warehouse operation looks like before we try to run one from a distance." He looked at her. "You want me there." "I want you there," she said. Not as a concession, not as management of his feelings, just as a fact stated directly, which she was getting better at. He nodded, once, the way he nodded when something settled into place. "Won't." The spring came slowly that year, which Wyoming springs did. March was still cold, and April was inconsistent, and the garden behind the ranch house held its frozen ground longer than she'd hoped. But in the second week of April, on a Saturday when the light had finally shifted into something warmer and the mud in the yard had dried enough to be bearable, she went out to the garden with a trowel, and Grant came out 20 minutes later with a second trowel, and neither of them said anything about the fact that this was the first time he'd worked this ground since his first wife had planted it. They worked alongside each other for most of the morning. She put the tomatoes along the south edge, where Margaret had put them, because the soil there was already conditioned for it, and because it was the right place for tomatoes regardless of any other consideration. Grant worked the center plot without her directing him, and when she looked over after an hour, she saw that he'd organized it in a way that suggested he'd been paying more attention to Margaret's system than he'd admitted to himself. "You remembered," she said. He looked at what he'd done. "Apparently," he said. She went back to work. The soil was real under her hands, cold still, but giving, with the particular texture of ground that had been well tended and then neglected, and was now being asked to produce again. She thought it would. She thought most things would, given enough time and the right conditions and someone willing to put in the hours. There was no single moment when the ranch had become home. That was not how it worked. It had become home the way the garden soil had become workable, gradually, through accumulated small things, until one day you looked up and the ground had changed under you and you were standing somewhere different than where you'd started. She was 25 years old. She'd arrived in Wyoming with $43 and a practical arrangement and no particular certainty about anything except her own willingness to work. She had made mistakes, had underestimated and overextended and missed the small print once, and been wrong about things she thought she'd calculated correctly. She was not a finished person. She suspected she would not be a finished person for a long time, if ever, and she had arrived at something like peace with that. What she understood now, working the garden on an April Saturday with Grant a few feet away, was that the women in the dining hall and the men on the ranch and the operation in Denver and the contracts still to be negotiated, none of it had been built by someone who knew what she was doing. It had been built by someone who kept going when she didn't, who learned what she needed to learn when she needed to learn it, and who was honest about the difference between what she knew and what she was guessing. That was the only version of capability that was real, the kind that didn't require certainty before it moved. The people who'd told her she wouldn't last, and there had been many of them, some who'd said it to her face and some who'd said it through open windows, had been working from a reasonable assessment of the available evidence. She understood that. She didn't hold it against them. They'd looked at a 25-year-old woman stepping off a stage in a small Wyoming town with a trunk and a practical arrangement, and they'd concluded that the odds were not in her favor. And the odds had not been in her favor. But the odds were not the whole story. The odds were just the beginning of the story. She pressed the last of the tomato seedlings into the south edge soil and sat back on her heels and looked at the garden. It was rough still. It would take the season to know whether the work was holding. "It looks like something," Grant said. He was standing, looking at what they'd done. "It looks like a start," she said. He considered that. "I'll take a start," he said. She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at the garden and the ranch beyond it, and the hills past the ranch that were showing the first uncertain green of a Wyoming April. And she thought, yes, this is what she'd come for, though she hadn't known it when she came. Not the money, not the contracts, not even the business she'd built. All of that was real, and she was proud of it in the specific, private way she was proud of things. Not loudly, not with performance, but deeply, in the part of herself that kept account of what she'd actually done versus what she'd merely intended. But this was what she'd come for. The ground under her hands, the person beside her who had stopped being absent. The women in the dining hall who had names and wages and reasons to get up in the morning. The young man with the big ears who had grown up. The foreman who had changed his mind. The things that were real. She picked up her trowel and walked back toward the house. And Grant walked beside her, and the April light was thin and clean, and the mud in the yard had the smell of ground that was ready to produce. And behind them, the garden held the work of the morning in its dark, imperfect, newly opened soil. The woman everyone had underestimated did not arrive at the end of her story standing on a mountain. She arrived at it covered in dirt on an ordinary Saturday, building something that would outlast the season. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.